It's time for some top secret kitchen table astronomy at the Amherst kitchen table of Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe. I don't know what we can and can't say about this conversation, but you handed me a cryptic business card to start off our conversation today. You have just come from an event. Tell us what you can tell us.
Which is not much, Monte. No. So I just attended last week and then end of last week a small workshop. About 25 people were there. And the workshop was organized or funded by the National Science Foundation. And it was about UAPs. So this is the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena.
Not even aerial anymore. They keep changing this.
Right, it's just anomalous.
It used to be UFOs.
Well, right. So this is formerly known as UFOs. So that's where a small group of people were brought in to talk about it. And
why were you chosen to be part of this small group in DC with the biggest names in the world of aliens?
No, I was. They actually had a sort of like an application process in which they asked, okay, so this is what's going on. How can you contribute to it? And as Monte, you and I have talked for over a decade where these things come up. I am genuinely interested in this issue. If the UAPs are alien spacecraft, and I'm very careful in the way I'm phrasing it, if they are actually alien spacecraft, well, that's a really impactful, unbelievably huge thing. And so that is one aspect, but I also teach a class called Aliens, Close Encounters of Multidisciplinary Kind at Hampshire College. I developed it about 10 years ago and I've taught it many years. And I'm also interested in from public engagement perspective, because you and I talk about it on the radio. I have a channel that also is in English as well, but also for audience in South Asia. And there is a huge public interest in it. So what I said, I actually, in some sense, check the boxes of education and public engagement. And I'm an astronomer by training, from which if those UAPs are alien spacecraft, then certainly it actually dramatically alters what you think about astronomy in terms of astrobiology or in terms of search for life in the universe. So all of those things combined together. And so it was, there was a whole spectrum of beliefs in some sense, and I'm including mine as well, that no, I don't think there is evidence for UAPs, but there were also people who thought that actually there is very strong evidence for that. In fact, the aliens are here and the question is of cover up, so those were also there. So it was a very interesting workshop, and the purpose of it was, in some sense, it wasn't to show that, there wasn't a presentation that would come out from the government, from the hidden vault saying, okay, here is the evidence. No, that was not the purpose of the workshop.
Too bad, because I thought for sure you were going to come back from that workshop like a changed man, saying like, you won't believe what I saw and I'm not allowed to tell you about it. But that's not how you're acting right now.
Well,
unless you are a very good actor.
Thank you very much. No, but that was, I think we talked about it. I thought that would be the coolest thing if I came back and told you, Monte, I'm sorry, we cannot talk about it on the radio.
Yeah, that would have been the coolest thing. That would have been enough evidence for me to believe.
That would have been the coolest thing. Unfortunately, no, I can't talk to you about it, and I am talking to you about it. So here is the thing. The purpose of the workshop was UAPs. They changed the name in order to address the stigma attached to UFOs. Mm-hmm. So they changed the name to UAPs. The problem is that now everybody, and just like you and I are talking about it, UAPs have also now translated into UFOs.
Right.
So there is a foundational problem regarding that, because the public interprets these things always as alien spacecrafts, but there is a lot more. Now, there is a lot of blame to go on many people in terms of why people always translate UAPs into, or UFOs into flying saucers, but that's a separate story. The purpose of this workshop was to remove some of the stigma in thinking about and investigating the nature of UAPs. And one of the things is because, again, this is unidentified anomalous phenomena, so, well, we don't know. And so some people are investigating that. And one of the issues is, and this is true, that many of the military personnel or airline pilots or others, when they come out and say previously that, hey, I think I saw a UFO or a UAP, they would sometimes be repercussions against them. They would be sent for mental checkness or something like that, psychological assessment and aspects regarding that, because of the stigma attached to, really, did you see a flying saucer? Mm-hmm. And so there has been an effort that, well, we should not be penalizing people for coming out and saying what they saw.
Right.
So I think that I 100% agree with that. Should not be any kind of stigma attached to that. And so one of the motivations for this workshop, or one of those, to how do we talk about UAPs in a manner that can progress, that can make that can make this topic worth investigating in a serious manner. And hence you had people from across the spectrum, so people who say, hey, we have evidence for it, and I genuinely believe that, versus people who were a bit more skeptical, like me, for example, to sit together and see, okay, well, here is an actual issue, and what is the nature of UAPs, if those are alien spacecrafts or if we have discovered alien bodies. How do we really talk about to the public what is our responsibility, and how should we address this topic? So that was one of the key motivations for this conference, of how do we set even the questions, or how do we create some sort of common language across this broad spectrum, so that we can actually have a conversation rather than just dismiss each other offhand.
But they didn't. It's a conversation about nothing at this point, because they didn't provide any evidence they didn't provide an alien body or evidence of flying saucers. And you were kind of like the Debbie Downer of the conference in some ways, because people did give presentations where they talked from their place of belief, but with no tangible evidence.
Well, to a certain degree, but I do think that UAPs should be investigated, right? And there were talks, there were people there, and there were some talks as well, on what kind of detectors can be made. So how do you respond to it? Even when people believe, or even if people are skeptical, there are things that are unexplained. I mean, let me be very clear about it. It's not that we know what all the sightings are, right? The question is, my problem comes in, is the jump from we don't know what something is to it is an alien spacecraft. That is a fallacy. That is a jump that you cannot make, because you need a positive evidence for claiming something is there, rather than I don't know what it is and hence it is something. Mm-hmm. That's part one of it. And of course, part two of it, where my criticism comes in, is the claims that last year there was a congressional testimony also by David Grush. He was I think, former intelligence officer or something like that, in which he had made claims that they were, in the congressional testimony, he says non-human biologics. And in non-congressional testimony, he has actually explicitly said that people who talk to him have seen alien bodies over their recovered crash, and so on and so forth. That is a much bigger claims and things like that. So again, there is a bit of terminology issue. So when you're talking about alien bodies, for example, but those are not UAPs, right? Unidentified anomalous phenomena, that is not the case, but it actually gets looped in there. So one part of this workshop, to a certain degree, is that how do we define these things, right? I mean, what are we talking about? We have to define these various things, otherwise it just gets swept into just one category. So let me give you a solid example of a positive thing coming up. One of the things was, why don't we have, and there are some apps, but this is another idea, that you can have an app. Just like, for example, you have apps for tree identification or bird identification. You look at it, you don't say, oh, well, hey, I don't know what bird is, this must be from another planet. Well, you don't say that, right? But you go, oh, you just don't know what this bird is, or you don't know what this tree is. Other planet one was just a joke. Mm-hmm. But you, in some sense, you start with your own ignorance and curiosity with that, right? I mean, because you want to know what it is and you may not know what that is, and so you use this app and this app gives you information and you go like, I see what it is and cool, right? In the same way, potentially, a lot of the reports for UAPs, for example, turn out to be Venus, the planet Venus, or Jupiter, especially Venus because it's lower down in the atmosphere and people think it's moving. Or I was surprised to know that a lot of the times misidentifications are actually birds. And they say if you look at it, like, if you're looking far away and then there are flapping wings and so on and so forth. So there are birds or other atmospheric things that people would know. Starlink satellites, for example, they go in a row, and if you see something at night and you go like, whoa, this was this whole row of lights. I saw that going across the sky, which I did see once, And so
You could thank Elon Musk.
that's right. And so you can have an app which has some of these things already in there. You go like, hey, you take a picture or you look at it, what this might be, and the app will tell you this is what it is, right? And if you have something that doesn't fit in, there is a system that actually goes in and reports it to a certain place. That could be the UFO reporting center or something like that. Now, that actually can help a lot because people will also know that how many things are up in the sky that sometimes we don't think about or we are not aware of, but they can be easily identified. They may be unidentified to you, but they are certainly identifiable and identified. And that will help actually the study of UAPs because you may then end up really looking at, rather than being flooded by this information. So this is what we call signal to noise issue, meaning to say if everybody is seeing everything and then reporting it, then the noise level is too high and your signal, the real signal, is much lower. But if people who are reporting can actually remove that aspect, a lot of these things can be explained, then the really interesting anomalous observations can be put there and then those can be investigated. Now that is a positive, so as I mentioned, that's I think a really excellent thing because we don't know what some of these things are. In astronomy, and you and I have talked about, for example, gamma ray bursts, right? We didn't know what those were. For a long time, there were different ideas about those things, and it took 30 years to figure out exactly the nature of gamma ray bursts, and those were just bursts that happened. Now, in these cases, we don't know where some of these things are. And that is an interesting issue, and even if you believe that those are alien spacecraft, well, yeah, you would like to get more evidence for that beyond the grainy pictures. That was one of the things that also came up. We want to improve the quality because even now we don't have clearer quality to that. So if we can do that, if we can have cameras, detectors at different places, maybe we will capture that clearly. On the other hand, if there are things that are happening in the atmosphere, natural phenomena, for example, which we don't know what those are, that would be really interesting to science as well. So I think that is an approach that really takes a positive step in terms of, for all sides ought to be, as a scientist, I would say, yeah, you should be interested in why there are things that we cannot explain that happen in the atmosphere. What are those things? That I think would be really interesting. Again, but that's a different step if you say that those are alien spacecrafts. And in some ways that was one of my reservations, because then people start with the belief part first. It is an alien. Well, we have really no clue what those are.
And it's interesting that you became part of this 25-member group that the National Science Foundation put on in DC. People, believers, and also government officials were part of this. And you still walk away with it virtually unchanged, in your opinion, despite listening to presentation after presentation about belief. No one there that you spoke to gave you any sort of wink and a nod about but if you only knew what I know.
Okay, so first of all, it wasn't in DC, it was in Virginia.
Okay, close
just
enough.
As a fact.
You're a
checking
scientist, fact checking, yeah.
So I did, and I should mention, I think I can mention that there were people from a new group from the Department of Defense called All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. It's called ARROW. And they
sounds like a superhero office.
Right. So they are, again, this was from a congressional directive. This is an office within the DoD that is given sort of like, this job to actually figure out what the UAPs are. And so they are investigating historical claims as well and things like that. And so I had great conversations with those folks.
Despite the fact that the business card that I mentioned at the beginning doesn't even have the person's name on it. No names as part of Arrow.
No, but their main thing was that oftentimes people think, oh, this is the big government people and they are just skeptical to start with, or they're hiding stuff. Their goal to be there was actually, no, they are open. Anything that is out there, like, come in and tell us. And they have asked, for example, David Grush, who testified at Congress last year, from what I found out, that they have asked him to come in and talk to Arrow, because they are looking for any kind of, if you have experiences, if you have evidence, go and talk to them. And apparently David Grush has so far said no to come and talk to them. But to me, I mean, that was a really, open thing. That was a really important thing. And there is another group, NASA also has a working group that is also dealing with these evidence. So I think those things are there. My overall impression regarding that, I actually don't think I came unchanged. I did change. But my views went more when I had a conversation, and that's the reason why it's important to have a full spectrum of people over there. One of the places where I found that sort of like the barrier is, and that's the exact word that we were using at the conference also, like how do we break the barriers in involving various groups, how they are looking at it. To me, the big barrier is how you look at evidence. And there are people have experiences, and occasionally, Monte, you and I talked about alien abductions as well, and I teach that as well. In the same way, people have experiences of seeing things, and they get changed. So a lot of people look at interview-based stuff, qualitative stuff, and I think that's wonderful, because I myself have been doing qualitative stuff, and I love qualitative work because you get a lot of information about it. And so it is true that people believe that they were abducted by aliens, or people believe that they have seen a UAP as an alien spacecraft, or they believe that they experienced that. I think that part is true. That experience is true. So if you are going to say, do we have evidence that people have experienced alien abductions or alien visitations? The answer is yes. But then there is a separate question that comes in. Okay, but do we have evidence that aliens have visited us? Well, for that you require a different type of evidence. And so bridging those together, I think that's the problem that comes in, that people experience things. So just like alien abductions, those abduction experiences are real. Those are life-changing. People, in fact, even have PTSD. They actually show signs of trauma. But we also know that those can be explained potentially by sleep paralysis, by things that happen physiologically. And those physiological things you explain through the cultural frame that you have. So within the 20th century and 21st century, the US, and mostly US and Europe, developed countries, you explain those through the lens of, for example, alien visitations. In the medieval times, it was through succubi and incubi.
Like demons.
And in Muslim countries, it's through jinns, right? Now, one way to explain that would be, well, these are all various manifestations of aliens. Okay, that's one interpretation, but on the other hand, it's like this is something that people do without an alien interpretation, because if those are aliens, then you need a different type of evidence that comes from physical sciences. So, because I work on multidisciplinary stuff, my class is multidisciplinary, so I have deep respect for qualitative interview aspect, and I do believe that it actually tells you the truth about experiences. But if you are going to ask a separate question about the truth, whether there are alien spacecrafts visiting us, that would require a different type of evidence that comes from the physical sciences. And then For example, eyewitness testimony doesn't work, or just I believe it is doesn't work, right? So again, I'm not trying to minimize the experiences because the experiences are absolutely true. But if you're asking the question that were those experiences because of an external factor, that's a different question that you are asking. So either group, to minimize that, and what happens is that people who are more on the physical sciences side, and I'm like, from skeptical side, they dismiss the claims of experiences. They say, oh, they're just making this up. No, actually they have real experiences. And my bigger problem in some sense is that people who believe in the experiential part, they don't value the skepticism that is required for a physical evidence for that. So this is what I think was part of the barrier issue. They want to remove those barriers. The question is, how do we do that? I don't know, because as you can see, this is, in other ways to think about it, this is a true culture problem as well in terms of academia. But I think more broadly, to me, it looks like an issue really about science and religion in some sense, because people believe that they have evidence of God, and a lot of it is based upon experiential stuff. And people believe that we actually do have actual evidence for the existence of God. But from the science part, you go like, well, this is an unanswerable question. This is not what it is. That doesn't change anybody's views in terms of somebody who had a personal experience of God, right? And again, William James, the famous sort of psychologist, he at the turn of the century or 20th century, he wrote about this of varieties of religious experiences. And so, do people have religious experiences? Absolutely. But if you ask a thing, do they believe that that experience was about God? Absolutely. But there is a separate question if you say, do we have an explicit evidence from the physical sciences about the existence of God? Well, that's a very different question, and that requires a very different type of answers. So to me, the aliens in some sense, or this UAP phenomena, and we are talking about aliens, we are slipping into that category because ultimately that's what it's, the conference was not about, hey, here are this anomalous phenomena, what's going on in the atmosphere. That is not what ultimately the conversation was about. So I think that's an interesting frame to think about these things, that perhaps in the 20th and 21st century, and I'm not the first one to make this claim, but to think about this stuff as a modern technological manifestation of religion. But to me, going to the workshop clarified a bit more, because we were talking across the spectrum, and it was getting clearer in terms of where the lines of tension are and where the barriers are in terms of communicating about that. And I think that was very valuable, and how to think about it. So that was, I think the important thing is that we do have a conversation about it. We are not all going to agree, and that perhaps it is something to do with when we talk about science and religion as well. Not everybody is going to agree on that, but I think we can think about why we think differently. I think that in itself perhaps is something that's valuable without disparaging anyone. Then we can say, yeah, we have real serious differences, but that doesn't mean that I think you are not thinking clearly. I don't think that is the case. I think oftentimes it's about we are thinking differently rather than about thinking not clearly.
Maybe that conference will trickle to Washington, D.C., and we can sit down with people across the political spectrum to have more of these rational conversations.
Now that is more unbelievable than the flying saucers. But I should mention that there is expected sort of that we are gonna keep on continuing this conversation. So, and I should applaud the organizers, because whereas as participants we had a lot more freedom to say what you really thought, and I did say I should mention what I really thought. I think organizers did a wonderful job of really cultivating a space where every view was heard with politeness and with respect, and I think that was a hard thing to do, and I think that was something that was done. So kudos to them, and of course anybody who hears about it because of this stigma attached to that. Oh, it's a UAP conference. Oh, NSF did it. So keeping that in mind, I think it was a really well run, well organized, and well thought out conference. And if there is another one, Monte, I will give you an update on that. But I still hope I come back from it and say, Monte, I'm sorry, I cannot tell you what I learned.
Me too.